So welcome to SPL 2.5, Understanding Contracts and Avoiding Pitfalls. I'm Emma Moore. I'm a Senior Legal Advisor within the legal team, and I'm joined today by my colleague Kate Bird, who is also a Senior Legal Advisor in the legal team.
Afternoon, everybody.
Now we are just trying to move on our slides. And just to do an introduction to the wider legal team, you'll see at the first slide that we do have quite a large legal team now, given the size of the business at WSP, as well as myself and Kate on the claims, disputes and litigation side of things. We've also got the team that provides you with the contract review for the front end, the bid side of things. And then we've got our corporate lawyers as well. So that's the team just for future reference. And we'll be explaining a little bit more about how we all fit into what you do and can help you with what you do as we go through this session. Okay, so why are we here today, giving up some of our lunch hour to discuss contracts and pitfalls? Well, the important thing about understanding our contracts is that as well as doing a great job on designing things, structures, buildings, being involved in infrastructure and process plants for our clients, at WSP, we are a business, and therefore it's important that we get paid. We want to make sure that we get paid our fees on projects. And of course, it won't just be the fees at the outset, as with many projects, they are often a moving feast. Very often, the fee at the outset is nothing like the ultimate fee on a project as changes happen and things progress. And so it's important to make sure that we get our additional fees for additional services, compensation events, variations on the project. And that's an opportunity for us as a business and as individuals working on a project to make sure that we do maximise the fees that we get paid. Secondly, it's important to understand our contracts and avoid pitfalls to make sure that we avoid paying out on claims. Unfortunately, claims against WSP do happen. Mistakes get made, sometimes calculations go wrong. On big projects, things go over budget and over time, and we do get drawn into disputes. And sometimes even our biggest and best clients draw us into disputes. It is inevitable in the industry that we work in and as a business of our size. And when they happen, it often means that we end up making payments to clients for the damages that are being claimed. Even if we are successful in defending a claim, there will no doubt be wasted costs. We may instruct external solicitors or experts. And also internally, we are spending time and resource on claims. And that means we're not working on other projects where we could be earning fees. And ultimately, if a claim hits our insurance, it could mean that our insurance premiums go up. So these are the kind of pitfalls that we want to avoid, our claims costing our business and our projects money. So just to summarise that, what we're really saying is if you can recover your fees and any additional fees on your projects, and if you can avoid or minimise paying out in relation to claims on projects, then that's going to be the best financial outcome for your project and for our business. So how can we do that? Well, the best way to get paid is to make sure that we understand our contract and follow the contractual mechanism for getting paid. Arguably, when everything's going well on a project, our clients pay us and it probably doesn't really matter whether we've followed the contractual process to the letter. But if we're on the back of a pay less notice, or if our client just isn't paying us for something, and we have to think about pressing buttons in terms of dispute resolution, whether it's going to adjudication or litigation in order to recover our fees, it's crucial that we've followed the contractual mechanisms to get paid. So we need to understand those clauses within our contract, and not just the payment clauses, but also the clauses that tell us how to get additional fees, compensation events as they're described in some contracts, or the change mechanisms or variation procedures that we've got to follow in order to make sure that we get those additional fees. It's also crucial that we keep good records to show that we have put our notices, our applications, our invoices in when we say we put them in, and keep those centrally so that we can refer to those if there is any dispute about payment. And also involving the legal team early. If you've got a problem with the client not paying you on a job, involve us and we can help you with that. Similarly, when we want to avoid PI type claims ultimately, again, it's important that we understand our contract, that we get the scope right at the outset. We know exactly what we're contractually supposed to be doing and what others within the design teams or subcontractors, contractor are supposed to be doing, and make sure that's all very clearly set out within our contract. We also want to make sure that we keep good records and follow good processes during the operation of the contract, so that if anything does go wrong, whether it's due to something that we've done or something that another party has done, we've got good records to defend our position or minimise the impact of it. And then just understanding how to manage a claim if it does arise, when to involve others, including ourselves, the legal team. And so as a result of thinking about how we can avoid claims and maximise our fee recovery, we've come up with these top tips for you. Firstly, get the contract terms and scope correct. Secondly, understand your contract. Don't just put it in a drawer. Understand exactly what's in there so you can get paid and avoid claims against us. Keep good records and follow good processes. And fourthly, manage claims by engaging with the legal team if there is a claims problem. And before we go into the detail of those top tips, I'm just going to hand over to Kate to give you a bit of a revision as to what is a contract and what claims look like at WSP.
So some of the contracts that we commonly come across as a business are listed here. We've got the appointment, whereby we're appointed to carry out the work. Collateral warranties. These are used to create a contractual relationship between us and a third party. So we might be appointed by a client but provide a collateral warranty to a funder, or appointed by a contractor and give a collateral warranty to the ultimate employer. We often see novation agreements to use to novate our appointments, so where we've carried out design services for a client, we might be novated to the contractor when construction commences. Framework agreements and call-off agreements are often referred to as task orders. We often see those. Reliance letters, these are used where we might have prepared a report for one party and another party, such as a buyer, wants to rely on it. Non-disclosure agreements, which we see in situations where we've been provided with confidential information by a client and they want to protect that information. And then other things such as letters of intent, deeds of variation and settlement agreements. So just to remind us what a contract is. A contract is a legally enforceable agreement which sets out the rights and duties among those who agree to its terms, and it needs the following key elements. The offer, and at WSP, our fee proposal with accompanying terms and conditions would constitute an offer. We need acceptance, So an example of this would be the client instructing us to proceed on our terms and conditions. Consideration, and this is commonly the money, so payment of our fee. An intention to create legal relations, which is presumed in a commercial situation. And then certainty of the key terms. So we need to have an agreed position on the parties, the scope, payment, and timing. And the key thing to remember is the best way for us to have certainty of terms and to avoid disputes about what those terms are, such as what the scope is, what our duty is, what our fees will be, is to have a signed contract. And by that we mean signed by all parties, or to have written acceptance of our terms and conditions. I'm just going to run through some examples of what we mean by claims at WSP and what we often see. So these might be contractual disputes, where we have a client disputing the amount of our invoice and issuing payment notices or pay less notices, setting out their belief that we're entitled to a sum lower than the amount we've claimed. A contractor not paying invoices because they're not getting paid by the ultimate client. We see situations where clients don't pay because we haven't signed an appointment. So often there might be a clause in the appointment which says that payment is dependent on us providing a signed copy of the appointment. So we need to make sure that we get that in. And scope issues are quite common as well, whether something is a compensation event or a variation. We also see professional negligence disputes. There's quite a few examples there of things that we've seen. Allegations that structural steelwork calculations are incorrect. Allegations that air conditioning systems don't meet specification. There can be issues around site surveys that we've done. Allegations that our design is incorrect. An example there of signalling on track being in the incorrect place. Wind turbine base design not to specification. Allegations that we failed to check and inspect subcontractors' cladding works, and then claims around late or incomplete provision of design information causing knock-on delays to the project. So just to look again at that slide that Emma showed us before and remind us of the top tips, the top 4 there. I'll touch on the first one, which is getting the contract terms and scope correct. We've got good processes in place at WSP, and it's really important that we follow them. The first there is to make sure we get the contractual terms correct and have good contractual terms in place. And the way to do that is to follow the processes that we've listed. So the risk grading tool, RGT, should be completed for all prospects, and it ensures that risk is properly reviewed, that any potential issues are identified and unlocked at the earliest possible stage, and that the appropriate level of authorization is obtained. And it's the project team's responsibility to complete the RGT, with the legal team here to support. Once we've done that, it's important to get our terms right. And when we're looking at projects of a value of less than £30,000, WSP standard terms and conditions are mandatory, and they're also encouraged on use for other projects as well. Where we're looking at a project value of over 30,000, then you need to submit a review to SharePoint for a legal review. You can get additional training on RGT and the WSP standard terms and conditions, and the course details are listed there, and they're available through Business World. It's also really important that we get the scope right. You need to review the scope document, be clear about what you've agreed, and ensure that the agreed version finds its way into the contract, because we have had situations where we think we've agreed the scope, and actually when we look at the version that's made its way into the contract, it's not the one that we thought we'd signed up to. So check your scope obligations. We're seeing an increased focus on supervisory, monitoring, inspection, certification roles. So even though we might get our design right, we can face claims where we've taken on a supervisory or inspection role. So we need to ensure that we understand the role that we're taking on, that we have the relevant experience and that we've priced properly to carry out that role. If the scope document doesn't reflect what we've priced for, it needs to be changed. And if it's a client scope document, fully review it and make sure that you're comfortable with it. And then finally, make sure we get a complete set of signed contract documents and keep a copy of those on the project file.
Okay, thanks, Kate. And now back to tip 2, making sure that you understand your contract once you've entered into it. As I said earlier in this webinar, it is arguable that when a project is going really well and our client is happy and all the other parties involved are happy on a project, that we'll get paid, and it really doesn't matter as much that we've followed all the correct processes for payment under the contract. However, when things start going wrong and a client starts paying less than we want them to, or isn't properly paying us in accordance with the contract at all, it's crucial that we've followed the contractual provisions in terms of notice requirements and our payment provisions. The first thing that we always look at as lawyers, and we would encourage you to always look at before you start on a project, is your notice provisions. Check where you're supposed to be sending notices to the client to. Is it only a hard copy to the registered office or to the site address? Is email okay? Is anything specific required when you, for example, issue your payment application or invoice, such as purchase order? And then when it comes to payment, check what's actually in your payment provisions within the contract. It's a good idea, even though at the start of jobs we normally get paid as and when we apply for the sums or we invoice, to still get into good habits at the start, so that if something does become more troublesome later on in a project, we've been following the correct payment process. And we continue to follow that so that we can use that potentially in order to press buttons in terms of dispute resolution, adjudication, or litigation. As many of you may know, something called the Construction Act, the Housing Grants Construction and Regeneration Act, implies certain terms into most of our appointments. If it's a construction contract within the UK and it doesn't fall within the process exemption, the Act provides that we have to have certain things within our contracts in terms of payment, such as a fair payment mechanism, a due date, a final date, and the rights for the paying or the payee party to provide a payment notice or a default payment notice and a pay less notice. And even if the Construction Act doesn't actually apply and imply these terms, they're often written into our contract in these ways anyway. So you usually have these terms set out within the contract, and even if they're not, they're implied. And what these terms mean is that if by the final date for payment, the client, the paying party, hasn't paid the notified sum, and that will be the notified sum that's either in our payment notice or within their payment notice, and they haven't served a pay less notice saying that a lesser amount is due, then they're in breach of contract and the Construction Act by not paying us for that final date, for payment. And this gives us a right to adjudicate for the sums not paid, or it gives us a right to suspend if we give a notice, normally with 7 days, allowing them to pay. And if they don't pay at the end of those 7 days, we can suspend our works. So if we followed our processes, it leaves us in a really good position where they just haven't paid the amounts that they're supposed to pay. There may also be other situations where they are issuing us with pay less notices, and of course in those situations there may actually be arguments about the way that our applications or invoices are assessed. But again, if we followed the right contractual mechanisms, we have got a better chance of being able to recover those amounts and argue about those amounts in the correct forums. In addition, on contracts, and this will apply to most projects except perhaps some of the very short or discrete ones, there will be changes throughout the course of the project. There will be variations, there will be things that are client risk events, which may entitle us to additional time and money. So it's crucial that we understand the variation or compensation event provisions, any change control provisions within our contract, and make sure that we follow the correct processes for getting instructions where there are variations, for making sure that where additional payments in relation to those variations are agreed, for making sure that if there's something like compensation event regimes, such as under NEC contracts, that we follow the correct provisions within there. Specifically in relation to NEC contracts, watch out for the time bars to time and money. Under clause 61.3 of the NEC contracts, if we don't notify the client of a compensation event within 6 weeks of it occurring, we're not entitled to time and money. So, for example, if the architect on a project hasn't given you an appropriate drawing, and you know that that's going to delay you and potentially lead to additional fees, then it's crucial that you notify the client within 6 weeks of that. Otherwise, you're not going to be entitled to time or money in relation to that compensation event. You also may have an opportunity to take advantage of certain provisions in relation to, for example, compensation events. Under the NEC contract, if you've notified a compensation event and the client, or under the new NEC contracts, the service manager hasn't responded to that within the period under the contract, which is usually 2 weeks, you can write to them and tell them they haven't responded to that. And if they still don't respond within a further week, that compensation event will be deemed accepted. So following those kind of provisions within your contract is an opportunity for getting compensation events deemed acceptance and also quotations deemed accepted as well. And there are other provisions within certain contracts which also give us advantages in terms of getting additional fees, such as the early warning provisions and the programming provisions within NEC. By following those, we will maximise the amount that we can recover in relation to compensation events. So all good reasons for understanding our contract as much as we possibly can in order to maximise the amount of payment and fees that we receive. It's also important that we understand and apply our contract in order to avoid claims against WSP. As Kate mentioned earlier, there are a number of our claims where we think we understand who's doing what, but actually that might not be what the contract says. And it's important that we are very clear that if we think we're only doing above ground drainage, the contract doesn't say we do below ground drainage as well. It's also important to be very clear about what subcontractors or contractors' design portions are outside our contract, and make sure that we don't start commenting on drawings or other documentation that might actually relate to works that sit outside our scope, because we can inadvertently take on responsibility and therefore liability for those parts of the design just by commenting on them. So understand your scope and you're less likely to do that. And also insist on instructions or your compensation events, or the client following the change control process in relation to variations. So that's all well documented. And in a dispute scenario, it's all very clear what the client had asked us to do and what has been done as a result of client decisions. Okay, so on to tip 3, which we touched on a little bit earlier. In claim scenarios where we're defending claims or where we're trying to make a case for recovery of our fees, it is crucial that we have the documentation to back up our position. So we would encourage everyone, and it is the proper process to follow within the business, to keep all your documentation on a central electronic project folder. Don't store emails, documentation on laptops or external drives or other places not accessible to the business. And also, even though a lot of our clients, particularly contractor clients or end users like Network Rail, will have their own project management systems, it's important that we don't just rely on uploading documents onto those as a place to be able to look at and recover documents in the future. We have had claim scenarios where contractor client has shut down the project management system whenever we've got into that claim situation. So we haven't then been able to go back on it and check when drawings were sent to them and the dates that those were sent, in order to back up our position that we hadn't been late. So it is really important that we keep a record of everything within our WSP system. And in terms of records and documents, it's really is very broad and includes contracts, emails, correspondence, meeting minutes, drawings, calculations, details that you've got from others. Please do keep all those things centrally recorded, because these are going to assist us in the long run if there are any claims. It's also important to follow good best practice approaches for reviewing documents. Quite often, drawings, designs come across our desk in relation to parts of the design which has been done by the contractor or perhaps subcontractor, design that doesn't sit within our scope. And the risk is that because it's come across our desk, at some point in the future, a client may try to bring a claim against us. Perhaps the subcontractor who's provided that bit of design has gone bust, and so we're one of the last men standing, and it's much easier to bring a claim against us. If they can say, oh, WSP, you looked at that design, then they may have some semblance of a claim against us. But if a document's come across our desk and it sits outside our scope, then if we return that saying we haven't reviewed this as it's outside our scope, we've been very clear that it's not something that sits with us, and we suggest that it's haven't reviewed as outside our scope rather than no comment, as no comment may suggest that it is something that's been looked at and that we are happy with and approving. Okay, and finally, tip 4, good claims management. As we said at the outset, claims can't be totally avoided, whether the claims because of errors in design, because something has just gone wrong on a large project, or because fees aren't being paid. Claims do happen. Where there's a problem or a complaint about our work, where we know about an error that's been made, or where a client isn't paying our fees. Notify the legal team, the claims team within the legal team as early as possible. Get our engagement in order to assist you with getting the best resolution as early as possible. WSP has a really good no blame culture, and by getting the right people involved at an early stage, we do have very good experiences of even where something has gone wrong and it's down to us. We've got something wrong in terms of an error in our design. We've worked with the client without admitting liability or prejudicing our own position in order to achieve an early resolution and minimise the impact of that error. And it's led to a position where the client has said they'd be happy to work with us in the future. So it's been the best overall result for us as a business and the client. As a legal team, we will be able to provide you with guidance on the law and the process. We'll be able to work with you to make sure that correspondence or reports that you're producing in relation to the problem attract privilege, so that long term, if something ends up in litigation or arbitration, we don't have to disclose it to the other side. We keep third parties updated, we notify insurers, we can get external legal representation and experts involved in claims as necessary. We'll also, because we have an overview of what's going on across the business, there may be common issues, whether it's a client, contractor that isn't paying across other parts of the business, or an example of a PI claim that we are seeing raised repeatedly, such as in the wake of Grenfell, cladding issues and fire safety issues being raised by clients. So we've got a good overview across the business, and we can give you some guidance as a result of that. And ultimately, we will work with you to facilitate and promote a good and appropriate settlement resolution at the earliest possible opportunity. So please do engage with us early. If you have correspondence in relation to a potential claim, please only acknowledge receipt of it. Certainly don't admit liability. Talk to us and we can assist you with the right kind of wording to go back with, which engages with your client in order to try to mitigate the problem, but without admitting liability. If you get into a claims scenario, please make sure that you are preserving your documents. We've already talked about the fact that the best business practice is for all documents to be stored centrally, but it's even more important in a claims scenario that you ensure your whole team on the project have done that and continue to do so. And ultimately, what we're looking for with you is the best possible resolution, so that in a claim scenario, we mitigate the loss and we make sure that any impact on the business is as small as possible. And just a reminder there, in terms of involving the legal team, at the outset, in terms of getting your contract right, you can go through the intranet in order to access the RGT and to make a legal referral via SharePoint. In terms of any claims, whether they be to try to recover fees or a PI type claim that's being made against us, or an error that you know about that may lead to a claim, please get in touch with myself or Kate or Helen Turner, who all sit within the claims and disputes part of the legal team. Okay, well, thank you for listening to the webinar up to this point. I'm just going to unmute the mic now, so if anyone has any questions, they can ask those. Alternatively, there is a chat button, so if you want to ask us a question by chat, please do so that way. Okay. So that should just have unmuted people. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask at this point?
Hi Emma, it's Gareth Howells here.
Hi Gareth.
Hi, can I ask you a question, Emma? It was mentioned earlier that the signed contract documents should be kept on the folder. We often don't see those because they're sent to legal to get signed. What's the process around that? How do we make sure that works properly?
Yeah, if they're sent to legal to get signed by WSP, we keep a copy of the WSP signed contract. But what often happens then is it gets sent to the client, and it's really then for the project director or the project manager to ask for the return of that contract from the client. And I think there has to be a little bit of liaison probably between perhaps the project team and legal just to make sure that that's happened. Because quite often what we've seen in the past is we sign a contract and then it's sent to the client and we never get it back. The client feels happy at that point because they've got it signed by WSP, but there's no momentum or anything really driving them to send it back to us. So it's unfortunately the project team who's got that sort of relationship with the client are the best place to actually ask the client just to send that to us. But we do now keep copies of the contract as signed by us on the legal team, and when we get it back from the client, that will be kept as well. Historically, it's been a bit different, particularly where there have been acquisitions and systems have changed and things. There's sometimes a bit more of difficulty in terms of locating the contracts, as you'll probably be aware, Gareth.
Yeah, well, that's I suppose a bit of the thought behind the question. So now do they get saved on the project folder or do they get saved somewhere?
So from legal's perspective, they'll be saved centrally on the legal folders, the legal system. So you should really have a copy on your project folder as well.
Yeah.
And if you don't, you can ask the legal team.
Okay.
So what I would suggest is good practice from a project perspective is to ask the legal team for a copy of that and save it yourself on your own project folder. And then if we haven't got it signed by the client, to chase that up directly with the client.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gareth. Any other questions? It's all gone very quiet. If anyone does want to ask questions, Mel.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, chat. Okay, thank you. Okay, from Anna Gonzalez. Could you confirm if projects under 30k that are signed with client with whom we have a framework in place will be acceptable to have the bespoke terms and conditions? So if a project's under 30k, we would expect it to be signed on on the standard terms and conditions now. If it's a framework agreement, that is a slightly different situation because the framework agreement should have gone through the risk grading tool and the SharePoint legal referral process. And then when there's a call off or task order, whatever it is under that framework agreement, that won't have to keep coming back through legal because the framework agreement itself will have been approved previously. Does that answer your question, Anna?